Why is the French president suddenly so apparently interested in Middle Eastern politics? Emmanuel Macron's only been in the job a year and has problems at home, but he is now positioning himself as a leader in geopolitics. Peacemaker, troublemaker. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. A young, charismatic world leader with big ideas. The French president is positioning himself, it seems, as a global mediator, but are his diplomatic negotiations perhaps hiding a personal agenda? He has been France's president for only a year, but Emmanuel Macron is asserting himself as one of the world's power brokers. As President Donald Trump looks to pull the US back from conflicts abroad, Macron has stepped forward to take a lead role in the future of the Middle East. What is behind his diplomatic enthusiasm? Can he help to restore peace? With Germany trapped in domestic political gridlock and Britain dealing with the complexities of Brexit, Macron has strengthened France's position on the world stage.
We can build the 21st century world order based on a new breed of multilateralism.
Since coming into office, the president has visited 19 Middle Eastern countries. No other European or Western country has made such an effort, and he has already had diplomatic success. He persuaded Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to release the Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri from house arrest in Riyadh. And more recently, despite their differing political agendas, Macron said it was he who convinced Donald Trump to join the recent coalition airstrikes against the Syrian regime.
Ont pleinement réalisé que notre responsabilité aller au-delà de la guerre contre Daesh et que c'était une responsabilité aussi humanitaire sur le terrain et une responsabilité dans la durée pour construire la paix. C'est aussi pour cela.
His friendship with Trump blossomed during a US state visit, the first European head to be given that honor by Trump. Macron is attempting to soothe Trump's concerns over the Iran nuclear deal by seeking new terms, while mediating a bitter Saudi-Iran rivalry. President Macron may have received a warm welcome in America, but he will have a harder time convincing the Middle East and North Africa to trust him, given the decades of French colonialism. France sells weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Macron's been attacked by human rights groups for his support of the Saudi-led coalition's war in Yemen. The president also faces major unrest at home. In what is perhaps his biggest challenge since his election last May, tens of thousands of French workers have marched against Macron's hard-hitting economic reforms to cut public spending and scrap a tax on the wealthy.
On touche une population qui est déjà, vulnérable, de précarité, des personnes qui n'ont pas beaucoup de revenus. Par contre, c'est faire le beau rôle aux personnes les plus riches et on ne fait absolument rien pour la fraude fiscale.
His approval ratings have dropped to 40%, faster than any French president since Jacques Chirac in 1995. Is Macron the master of shuttle diplomacy, genuinely seeking to stabilize the Middle East? Or has his seduction of Trump and other leaders been a determined exercise in restoring France's cultural imperialism on the world stage? And to talk about all of this, I'm very pleased to say that we have from Paris a writer and historian, that's Gavin Mortimer, at the round table with me, Ian Black, a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics Middle East Centre, former Middle East editor and European editor for the Guardian newspaper. David Lees is here, who specialises in modern French history and politics at the University of Warwick, and Olivier Guitta, Managing Director of GlobalStrat, a geopolitical risk and security firm advising NATO, the EU and Europol. I am surrounded by people who are experts in this field. I know a lot because I've reported on the Middle East in general for the last 30 years, but I don't know the details. So let's start with Macron and Trump, if we may. If he's to prove himself to be a real global diplomat, perhaps he has to persuade Trump to hold off on not signing or ditching the Iran nuclear deal, and perhaps get the changes that he himself wants to see and that could yet save it. Is that likely? Olivier first.
Not really. I think a few things that you have to keep in mind is that the French have had a stormy relationship with the Iranians to start with. If it weren't for Macron, that Iranian nuclear deal would have been much worse for the West and the international community, and the French had to take a stand against Obama to make it much more powerful than it is now. I think he might play the good cop, bad cop with Angela Merkel strategy and be closer to Trump in that fashion, because he has offered to change the deal, especially on the ballistic missiles issue. But the question is, are the Iranians going to bite?
This is it. It's about the ballistic missiles, Ian, isn't it? And in what shape or form is he going to get changes, perhaps?
Well,
if he can.
I think that it's important to understand that the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran was very important but very narrow. It covered the nuclear issue. It left aside a lot of issues of concern. The ballistic missile program is one of them, but another one of those, in a sense even more difficult, is Iran's role in the Middle East, its activities in Syria, in Yemen, in support of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Those are really difficult issues, particularly for the Iranians. So Macron is raising the game by talking about the ballistic missile issue thing. The question is, will that satisfy Trump? And Macron himself, after his visit to Washington, actually was quite downbeat about the prospects.
Is he proving himself to be quite savvy on the world stage?
I think he is, yes. I think he's appearing to be a world leader in a sense that we haven't had very recently, at least not with François Hollande. I mean, François Hollande was nowhere near the same kind of diplomatic player on the world stage. But I do think that Trump does respect Macron, or seems to have some kind of respect for Macron, in a way that Macron is not afraid to tell him what he thinks he's thinking. I think the real issue is whether he can actually persuade Trump to do what Macron wants to do. And I think that's very, very unlikely.
Well, that is for the future, whether or not the deal survives or is consigned to history or is changed. Gavin, Macron at home, the suggestion's been put out there by quite a lot of people that the reason that he's concentrating so much on the international stage is because his popularity is falling in France.
I disagree. I think it's always been part of his strategy from the first moment he was elected, that really to re-galvanise France on the world stage. You mentioned François Hollande earlier. His presidency was a disaster in terms of international relations. And first and foremost, Macron wants to reboot, if you like, France on the world stage. And also he's someone, we have to remember his ego is such that he loves this part of the job, meeting the world leaders, presenting himself as the strong leader of Europe now. He's been given this great opportunity and he's going to seize it.
Do the French people care whether he's the strong leader of Europe or not, as long as he runs their country well?
Well, I think to the French, being a strong leader of Europe is very important, because how they're seen on the world stage matters to the French. And Macron, they may not like him. Opinion polls show that they may not like him as a person, as a man, but as a leader, they respect him. And they're actually, the reforms that he's pushing through at home, the majority of the French recognise that they are necessary now.
So let's talk about him and the Middle East in particular. Well, let's generalise first of all. Why is he so keen to play a role in so much of the Middle Eastern's incredibly messy politics? Who wants to kick that one off?
I think it's a historical reason. I mean, he's not the only one. I mean, the French obviously, after the First World War, had a vested interest, especially in the Levant. And the relationship that is there with Lebanon and Syria is so strong that every single leader of the Fifth Republic was very keen on getting a policy for the Levant. So that's not a big break from what happened. The big break is that he's not being diplomatic in the way that we think a president should be. He said it like it is. He has the respect of a lot of the leaders from Trump to Putin because he look at them in the eye and tell them hard truth that they don't want to hear from anyone.
And is he going to say the same thing to leaders of very rich Gulf countries that could put contracts the French way? What do you think?
I think that the Gulf is extremely important, but I think to stand back a little bit, I think that to understand Macron on the world stage, we have to look at two of the phenomena that are really changing the way the international system works. One is Donald Trump in the White House with his America First instinct and his generally unpredictable style, and I'm being quite polite. And the other is Brexit. Britain and France are both permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, like the United States, Russia, and China. Trump, we've referred to. Britain is embroiled in the drama, I'll use a neutral word, of Brexit, which clearly has implications for its role in the world and is already being felt. Macron has instinctively understood that here is an opportunity for France to play a bigger role than it has done in recent years, and I think particularly in the Middle East.
And is it France because it has a history in the Middle East rather than Germany, perhaps because Germany has concerns about appearing to be too dominant on a world stage, perhaps because of its past? Why France?
France has a history in the Middle East, particularly in the Levant, in Syria and Lebanon, but there's also North Africa, the Maghreb. Morocco was Macron's first visit abroad as president.
It was Algeria.
Algeria, okay. So,
and he said, forget the past, didn't he?
Yes. So for that, he has broken a lot of barriers. And I think that the main issue is for him in the Gulf, he wants to be as friendly with the Saudi as with the Qataris, which is exactly what they don't want in the GCC. They want countries to take sides. And he's come in and say, contracts do not matter any longer. I'll do the right thing. And you see that his policies, especially on financing of terrorism, for instance, that big conference that was in Paris, that was his baby. He wants Qatar to be at the table and say, look, we're going to change our stripes and we're going to be good customers.
Well, but I mean, it's worth pointing out that Qatar is an extremely important market for French goods and an investor on an enormous scale in France. Paris Saint-Germain is owned by the Qataris these days, right?
Right.
I mean, it's not entirely altruistic. I just wanted to.
I think we'll get into his motives if we can in just a moment, because a lot of contracts have come back to France. Quite recently.
You asked why not Angela Merkel. I think the domestic situation as well for Germany is very radically different from that for Macron. You know, Macron currently has virtually no political opposition at all in France. He has a relatively kind of clear hand in terms of being able to do what he wants, and I think he's looking for a challenge. And I think a challenge currently for him is the Middle East.
Well, let's go to Gavin then. If it is a personal challenge, what are the motives? Are they altruistic?
Well, I think an important factor, David, is Islamic terrorism, which of course is a huge problem in France. Not just the terrorist attacks, but just the fact that, and this is something that increasingly dominates the French press, what they call the Islamification of French inner cities. And it's the rise of Salafism, for example, in France is a real concern. And I think Macron's taking a very intellectual approach, and he's right to, because this is going to be a long-term challenge for the French. But if you look at some of the people who've perpetrated the attacks, they've had Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian heritage, and Macron knows that he's got to work with these countries, and also to Saudi Arabia, where a lot of the ideology comes from in the first place. So I think that's very much part of its strategy, and working it very interesting last month with the Saudis, the announcement that they're going to work with Saudi Arabia in establishing an opera and an orchestra in Saudi Arabia. And I think that can't be overlooked. But also, I think you mentioned the word legacy. Absolutely. Legacy matters to Macron, how he's seen, how he will be viewed after his presidency.
Okay, let's take a look at Saudi Arabia here. We're talking about Wahhabism and the problems in French inner cities and indoctrination. Does Macron see an opportunity with the probable next leader of Saudi Arabia, de facto leader at the moment, Emmanuel's Crown Prince Salman? Does he see a like-minded soul who wants to change things in Saudi Arabia and thereby directly in France as well?
I think he has made it possible for MBS to really try to portray himself as a revolutionary, if you will. He is the Crown Prince. And we've seen little steps. The Muslim World League head, for instance, went to the Great Synagogue in Paris. Some of the mosques that Saudi used to finance are now not being financed by Saudi. So I agree with Gavin. I mean, the issue is really combining the global agenda with the domestic agenda and trying to, when he meets a world leader that has an impact on France, to try to divert some of the negative
Okay,
influence.
so that's a few thoughts on Saudi Arabia. Where do we go now? Do we go to Lebanon? Do we go to Iran? Do we go to the Gulf countries? Do we go to Israel? I mean, where do you start when it comes to France's involvement, David?
Well, I think
what's top of the list?
Top of the list. I think for Macron, really, he does seem to be connected. I mean, Olivier is right to say in some ways he seems to be more of a kind of diplomat in many ways than Hollande. But I do think he's also motivated by France first in some ways, a kind of similar policy to Trump in the sense that he's looking to boost French economic coffers. And I do think he suspects that there are opportunities there in the Middle East to try and gain.
And has that material?
I think it would. I mean, you mentioned PSG, you know, being owned by the Qataris. I think there are opportunities there for the French and for Macron to go out and seek. Whether that's going to develop immediately or whether, as you say, the other main concern, which of course is the domestic situation with regards to terrorism in particular, whether that's going to take priority, I'm not sure. But I do think we come back to this dominating presence of Trump as well. And I do think that a lot of what Macron is going to do in the future will depend on what Trump goes and
does he see himself as Trump's honest broker?
I'm not sure whether he sees himself quite as that or whether he sees himself more as a kind of the only person willing to stand up to Trump in some ways.
Okay. Ian, I mean, with your history over the years of reporting on the Middle East, I mean, I mentioned 4 or 5 countries there. Of course, I missed out Syria. Where does his biggest challenge lie in taking on the mantle of the Middle East mediator?
I mean, first of all, I don't think, however ambitious a French president is or any other leader, no individual is going to do it alone. I mean, I think if we stand back and look at the Middle East, Syria is a disaster. We all got very excited a couple of weeks ago when the missile strikes were launched by President Trump with the British and the French.
But the suggestion has been since then, coming out from French circles, that Macron was the one who pushed for it and persuaded Trump and Britain.
I think that the French have been interesting on the issue of, you know, the war in Syria is now in its 8th year. We have got used to things going on which once, a few years ago, would have been completely unthinkable. The regular use of chemical weapons, for example, being the most striking of them. The French, I think, since Macron came into power, have been emphasizing those aspects of the crisis. So I think it was entirely consistent with that position that the French took part in those strikes.
But he's been bigging himself up a little.
He's been bigging himself up, and he also hasn't ruled out some kind of dialogue with Assad. It's quite clear, I think, that Assad has, with the support of the Iranians and the Russians, has won the war. The question now is how you get from a state of horrific suffering and millions of people having been displaced to some kind of political settlement. So Macron has a facility, it seems to me, to be able to position himself in, you know, potentially different directions at the same time. That's quite a trick. And if something were to develop on the Syrian diplomatic front, which it hasn't yet, then you could imagine that they would play a significant role.
But the danger is if you try to position yourself as all things to all men,
there is such
honest broker, whatever, that you end up pleasing nobody.
Well, you may end up pleasing nobody, but, you know, the Middle East in particular is crying out for solutions to long-standing and terrible crises. So, you know, perhaps if something were to happen on the Syrian front or on the Israeli-Palestinian front, for example, people would be more forgiving of, you know, facing in too many different directions at the same time if something good came of it.
So what has he got, let's say, when it comes to Middle East, perhaps that Tony Blair as the Middle East?
I think one country that we haven't spoken about is Russia. I mean, Russia is the main kingmaker in the Middle East. I mean, we can talk all we want about Macron and Trump, but under the Obama administration, Russia saw the void and just got in. And if you don't have somebody that will convince Putin that it's in his own interest that Syria will be ruled by Assad or another puppet or any other solution, it's not going to happen. Trump can jump up and down. It's not going to happen. Russia is the key to everything in this.
And Macron has the I was going to say something else. He's got the courage, he's got the conviction to be able to stand up to Putin. Has he done this?
Yes, he has done that. I mean,
and he's been in contact with Putin as well. I think he was working the phones in the recent period, precisely over this issue. He clearly recognises the importance of Putin.
Yes, he has to portray himself as being a tiger, not a paper tiger. And he has gained the respect of Trump and Putin, which is rare.
What about his commercial background in dealing with people? In the same sense that Trump has a commercial background and they see issues not necessarily emotionally, they see them in practical terms.
Making a deal, I think, is crucial really in terms of his capacity to make a deal. I think as well it's interesting in terms of going back to motivations a little bit. He is someone who's taken a huge pay cut to become president of France, to be a politician in any way. And so I think he is genuinely in it to try and make the deals he can, try and improve relations with people. But I think, coming back to the idea about can you please all people, can you be all things to all people? Ultimately, Macron, it's a win-win situation for him in terms of his domestic agenda at least, because he might be in some ways deflecting away from what's going on at home with the current strikes. But he either appears to be this kind of kingmaker figure who can solve the problems in the Middle East, or he appears to the French at least to be someone on the world stage as a kind of de Gaulle figure, which we've not had previously for the last 40 or 50
What would be a sign of some kind of achievement? In his eyes, Gavin, first of all, in terms of the Middle East, what would be seen as some kind of achievement?
Well, I just want to add to what David said there. Another motivation for Macron with the Middle East is immigration. This is from a sort of talking from France, which in the last week there's been a lot. The immigration and asylum bill has just been passed 9 days ago, and there's been confrontations in the Alps between pro and anti-migrant groups. And I think this is going to be more and more in the lead up to the 2022 election a factor. And there's an interesting article in the Figaro, the centre-right newspaper last week, which said that the 2022 election is likely, it's not going to be fought on the traditional left and right lines, but on national identity. And of course, you've got the far right, and you've got the more right-wing Guterres, the Republican leader. So I think that's another motivation for Macron to really get involved in the Middle East.
I will take the question that I was putting to you, because you've answered that point so very well, and throw it to Olivier and the table here. What would be seen, because I'm going to come to the corollary of this, what would be seen as an achievement, first of all, in terms of his Middle East policy?
I think the first thing would be to look at Syria, where he has spent a lot of time, and try to find a solution in terms of, a strong hand with a velvet glove. He has tried.
Is he getting anywhere?
No, but Syria is the big one in terms of the complexity of
Okay, so little steps first. What would be seen as below Syria in terms of a Middle East achievement? Or is everything else secondary?
What he managed to do with Saad Hariri, the Lebanese prime minister, who was summoned to Riyadh by the Saudis and effectively told to resign and held on some sort of house arrest, and he managed to broker some sort of deal which allowed Hariri to go back to Lebanon. It was a very, very dangerous moment.
And he gave him a special personal lunch at the Elysee Palace as well.
Well, he did all the presidential things too, but he solved a practical problem that had very, very dangerous and alarming implications, which I thought was quite impressive.
And did he do it by strong arming or just by...
I think he did it by using his influence with both sides. I mean, he was, the French in Lebanon, of all places, are well connected and they matter to them a lot. And they matter to the Saudis for reasons we've already discussed. And he did a deal which diffused what looked like the beginnings of, or evidence of, an escalating crisis.
And we all know what can happen once things go wrong in Lebanon.
Things can go wrong in Lebanon, can
the ripples.
The ripple effect can
be
enormous,
absolutely. Okay, so we talk about what might be seen as an achievement. Where could it all go wrong for Macron, David?
I think actually
where's the hubris?
Both an achievement and a failure potentially lies in Algeria. I think we've not talked very much about Algeria, but I think he has a real opportunity to mend the very, very difficult bridges between France and Algeria. And he has tried in terms of acknowledging some of the war crimes committed on the French part during the War of Independence. I think that could both work in terms of his favour, in terms of developing greater links between the two countries, but also trying to placate some of the Algerian second or third generation migrants living in France. Or equally, because it could be something which could be achieved quite easily, it could be a significant failure.
Yeah, okay, then that would be the major foreign policy failure.
I think so, because Syria, we talked about Syria, it's going to be very difficult to get a meaningful solution in Syria, which both suits Macron's needs and wishes, and also those of the wider Western world.
Just a quick thought on Iran. He was due to go to Iran either this year or next year. That's out of the way. It's not happening.
Yeah, it was due to go this past March. It's been put on hold, and we'll see with the next 10 days what's going to happen with the deal. But most probably he could go on a whim. I mean, he's the kind of guy that will decide that, look, there's something that can be done on the last day. I'll get on a plane and try to convince the Iranians to get the deal.
And surprised by what you've seen of Macron so far?
No, because
he's not an ingenue, is he? I mean, you know,
he's an investment banker. He's not a lawyer, so he wants to get the deal done, and that's something that was missing from all the presidents we had, that were all lawyers in background that would try to not affect anyone in playing diplomatic. He's there to get to the bottom line.
Thank you all very much indeed. Gavin, thank you. Many tests ahead for Emmanuel Macron. Perhaps he's surprised an awful lot of people by what he's achieved in the last year. It will be fascinating to keep an eye on what happens both with him and with the Middle East. From me, David Foster, my roundtable guest, and from the team that put this all together, thank you for watching. Hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye.